All right, let's go. Number 10. The Atapuerca Pit of Bones. In the Sierra de Atapuerca, in the limestone hills of northern Spain, there is a vertical shaft in the rock that drops 43 feet straight down into darkness. The chamber at the bottom is called the Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones. And at the bottom of that pit, approximately 430,000 years ago, someone began throwing bodies into the dark. Not one body, not two. At least 28 individuals, men, women, adolescents, recovered from a single chamber so remote and so geologically sealed that the only way for human remains to have entered it was for other humans to have put them there. There is no evidence of habitation in the pit. No hearths, no tools of daily life, no animal predator den. The bones did not wash in. They did not fall by accident in numbers like that, across the span of time the deposit represents. Something carried them to the edge of the shaft. Something let them go. The humans who did this were not us. They were not even Neanderthals. Not yet. They were Homo heidelbergensis, the pre-Neanderthal hominin lineage that walked Europe nearly 500,000 years before the first cave painting, before the first agricultural seed was planted, before language as we understand it can be confidently said to have existed. They lived in a world without writing, without metal, without anything resembling civilization. And yet they performed the act that anthropologists have spent a century trying to define as the threshold of human consciousness. They disposed of their dead with intention. The numbers are difficult to absorb. 430,000 years. To put that in human terms, the entire span of Homo sapiens as a species, every cave painting, every pharaoh, every empire, every war, every word ever spoken in every language that has ever existed, fits inside the final 15% of the time that has passed since those bodies were lowered into the Spanish dark. The Pit of Bones is older than our species. It is older than fire-controlled cooking in many regions. It is older than nearly every assumption we hold about when symbolic thought began. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing. In 1998, excavators working through the bone bed recovered a single object that did not belong to any body. A hand axe, pink quartzite, beautifully worked on both faces, unused, undamaged, deliberately shaped from a material that does not occur in the immediate cave system. The excavators named it Excalibur. It is the only tool ever recovered from the Cima de los Huesos. One axe, 28 bodies, 430,000 years. The implication is staggering. A hand axe in a Pleistocene context is not jewelry. It is the most valuable object a hominin could possess. It is a season's worth of skilled labor, a cutting edge, a survival instrument. And someone, 500,000 years ago, chose to throw it away, not lose it, not discard it, place it, with the dead, in a location where it would never be retrieved. The act has no utilitarian explanation. It is the oldest grave good in the human record. It is the earliest known moment in which a creature on this planet decided that an object should accompany a body into the dark for reasons that existed only inside a mind. What makes the Pit of Bones particularly unsettling is what it does to the timeline of ritual itself. For most of the 20th century, the academic consensus held that symbolic behavior, the capacity to imagine that the dead require something, that absence requires marking, that loss requires gesture, emerged with anatomically modern humans no earlier than 100,000 years ago. The Pit of Bones quadruples that horizon. It suggests that the impulse to honor the dead is not a feature of our species. It is older than our species. It was already here, waiting in the bones of something that was not quite us when we arrived. The chamber is still there. The bones are still being cataloged. An Excalibur, the single pink axe carried into the dark by a hand that was not yet human, still glitters faintly under museum light, the oldest answer to the oldest question, left for us by minds we will never meet. Number 9. The Shanidar Flower Burial. In 1960, archaeologist Ralph Solecki of Columbia University, deep into excavations he had begun a decade earlier in Shanidar Cave in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, lifted a soil sample from beside the skeleton of a Neanderthal man and sent it for pollen. Analysis. The man had been dead for between 65,000 and 70,000 years. The pollen told him something the bones could not. The grains weren't scattered randomly through the sediment in the proportions one would expect from wind or animal disturbance. They were concentrated, clustered, arranged in dense pockets directly around the body in patterns that no natural process could plausibly explain. Palynologist Arlette Leroy-Gourhan, who analyzed the samples in Paris, identified the species: yarrow, cornflower, hollyhock, groundsel, wildflowers gathered from the mountainsides above the cave, carried into the darkness, and laid against a corpse. The implications were not abstract. They were specific, and they were devastating to a century of assumptions. The man in the grave, designated Shanidar IV, was not the only burial in the cave. Solecki's team eventually identified the remains of 10 Neanderthal individuals in the chamber, several of them positioned in ways that suggested deliberate interment rather than accidental death. But Shanidar IV was the one that changed the conversation, and another individual from the same cave, Shanidar I, made the change permanent. He had lived to roughly 40 years of age, an extraordinary lifespan for a Neanderthal, despite injuries that should have killed him decades earlier. His right arm had withered to a useless stump, possibly amputated. His face showed evidence of a crushing blow that likely blinded him in one eye. His leg had been broken and had healed badly, leaving him lame. He was deaf in at least one ear. He survived all of this. He could not have survived it alone. Someone fed him. Someone sheltered him. Someone kept him alive through years of incapacity in a landscape that punished weakness with extinction. The community that buried Shanidar IV with flowers was the same kind of community that had carried Shanidar I through decades of disability. The two findings reinforced each other into a single, undeniable picture. The flowers themselves carry a further weight. Yarrow has been used for millennia as a wound stauncher and fever reducer. Cornflower has documented anti-inflammatory properties. Hollyhock soothes irritated tissue. Groundsel was employed as a folk medicine across Europe and the Near East well into the modern era. Every one of the species identified around Shanidar IV has known medicinal value. Whether the mourners selected them for their pharmacological properties, for their color, for their fragrance, or for symbolic associations now lost to us, the selection was not random. Someone walked the slopes above Shanidar Cave 65,000 years ago and chose specific plants, carried them down into the darkness, arranged them around a body. This is the act of a being who understood that death required a response, who believed on some level we cannot reconstruct that the dead deserved more than abandonment. The pollen does not tell us what the mourners thought as they laid the flowers. It tells us only that they laid them. What makes Shanidar particularly unsettling is what it forces us to recalibrate. For over a century, the Neanderthal had served as the convenient inferior in our species' origin story. Brutish, inarticulate, incapable of abstraction or grief. The discovery in Iraqi Kurdistan did not merely contradict this narrative. It demolished it. The beings who buried their dead with wildflowers were not lesser versions of us. They were practicing something we still practice today. They were mourning. They were marking the threshold between life and its absence with beauty and intention. And they were doing it 65,000 years ago, in a limestone cave in the Zagros Mountains, by torchlight that has long since gone out. The flowers decomposed within weeks. The body became bone. The pollen remained, locked in the sediment, waiting for someone to ask what it meant. The answer was that another kind of human, on another branch of our family tree, had loved someone enough to bring them flowers in the dark. Number 8. The Draenloch Bear Skull Altars. Between 1917 and 1923, a Swiss paleontologist named Emil Beckler led a series of excavations into a cave perched more than 2,400 meters up in the Swiss Alps. The site was called Draenloch, the Dragon's Lair, a name given by mountain villagers who had no idea what was actually waiting in the dark. Beckler's team climbed into a frozen alpine chamber that hadn't been touched by sustained human presence in tens of thousands of years. What they reported finding inside would unsettle the field of prehistoric archaeology for the next century. In the deeper recesses of the cave, Beckler described stone chests, crude rectangular boxes built from limestone slabs, containing the skulls of cave bears. Not scattered, not discarded, arranged. The skulls, some measuring nearly 12 inches in length, faced outward in deliberate orientations. Around them, long bones, femurs, tibiae, humeri had been laid in patterns that suggested intention rather than accident. In other parts of the cave, additional skulls were found wedged into natural niches in the wall, positioned as if observing the chamber. The deposits date back at least 75,000 years. That number deserves to be held in the mind for a moment. 75,000 years ago, the inhabitants of these mountains were Neanderthals, possibly accompanied by early waves of Homo sapiens drifting through Europe. Neither group is supposed to have built altars. Neither group, according to the older textbooks, possessed the cognitive machinery for symbolic ritual. And yet here, in a freezing cave at the roof of Europe, something or someone was stacking the heads of the largest predator in the Pleistocene world into stone containers. The interpretation that emerged from Beckler's findings was startling. A bear cult, a prehistoric tradition of veneration directed at Ursus speleus, the cave bear, a creature that stood over 3 meters tall on its hind legs and weighed nearly a ton. The hypothesis suggested that early humans, perhaps as part of hunting rites, perhaps as part of something closer to worship, were ceremonially preserving the remains of an animal that hunted them, sheltered with them, and occasionally killed them in the same caves they shared. But here's where the standard explanation grows more complicated. Later, archaeologists have questioned whether Beckler's stone chests were truly constructed by human hands, or whether natural cave processes, falling slabs, sediment shifts, freeze-thaw cycles, could have produced similar arrangements. The original site was disturbed during excavation. Photographs are limited. Reconstruction depends heavily on Beckler's own diagrams and descriptions. The bear cult, as a concrete archaeological certainty, remains contested. What is not contested is the presence of the skulls themselves. Dozens of them, carried, dragged, or otherwise moved into specific locations within the cave, arranged in ways that, even by the most skeptical readings, are difficult to fully explain through natural processes alone. Whether the hands that placed them belonged to Neanderthals performing a hunting ritual, to early modern humans practicing an inherited tradition, or to something we no longer have language for, the pattern repeats across multiple alpine caves in the region. Wildkirkli, Pettershöhle, Drakenloch, a constellation of high-altitude sites where the heads of cave bears were treated as something other than refuse. Imagine the conditions. A cave mouth 2.5 kilometers above sea level. Air thin enough to burn the lungs. Walls slick with ice. Beyond the firelight, the smell of damp stone, old fur, and the lingering musk of an animal that may or may not still be sleeping deeper in the chamber. And in that darkness, hands working slowly, lifting a 12-inch skull, turning its empty sockets to face outward, setting it down with the kind of deliberation that suggests the act mattered. The people who climbed those mountains to perform whatever it was they were performing are gone. The bears they honored, or feared, or worshipped went extinct roughly 24,000 years ago. The skulls remain. And on the other side of the world, in a dry lake bed under a southern sun, another set of hands was preparing the dead in ways equally beyond what history was willing to imagine. Number 7. The Lake Mungo red ochre burials. In 1969, geologist Jim Bowler of the Australian National University was mapping ancient lake beds in the dry interior of New South Wales when he noticed fragments of bone weathering out of an eroding sand dune on the shore of a vanished lake. The bones were burned, they had been crushed, and they were extraordinarily old. The site, now known as Lake Mungo, would over the following decade yield two of the most important human burials ever discovered. Bowler had not found a campsite. He had found the oldest documented funerary rituals on Earth. Mungo Lady, recovered in 1969, had been cremated approximately 42,000 years ago. Her body was burned on a pyre. Her bones were then gathered, deliberately crushed, and burned a second time before being buried in the lakeshore sand. This is not the residue of an accident. It is a sequence. Each step required intention, knowledge, and a shared belief about what death required of the living. The double burning of her remains represents one of the earliest known examples of ritual cremation anywhere in the archaeological record. 5 years later, in 1974, Bowler returned to the same dune system and uncovered Mungo Man, buried in extended position with his hands crossed in his lap. His body had been coated, head to foot, in powdered red ochre. The ochre is where the story becomes staggering. Red ochre does not occur naturally at Lake Mungo. The nearest known sources of the specific pigment used in Mungo Man's burial lie over 200 kilometers away. 42,000 years ago, before agriculture, before the wheel, before any of the technologies historians traditionally use to mark the rise of complex civilization, a community in the Australian interior carried ground mineral pigment across hundreds of kilometers of arid landscape to coat the body of a dead man. They did not need to. He was already dead. The ochre served no practical purpose. It was a statement about what his death meant, transported across a distance that would take weeks on foot by people who believed the journey was necessary. The implications dismantle the standard chronology of human spiritual development. The Egyptian pyramids were constructed approximately 4,500 years ago. Stonehenge was raised approximately 5,000 years ago. The first cities of Mesopotamia emerged roughly 6,000 years ago. Mungo Man was buried 36,000 years before the first stone of the Great Pyramid was cut. The Aboriginal Australian ancestors who carried that ochre across the desert were practicing elaborate funerary rites tens of thousands of years before the civilizations we routinely call ancient had even begun. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The conventional model of human cognitive development assumes that complex symbolic behavior, long-distance trade in non-utilitarian materials, and standardized burial practices emerged gradually, accelerating only as populations grew dense enough to require shared ritual frameworks. Lake Mungo represents none of these conditions. The population was small. There was no agricultural surplus. There were no temples, no priesthood, no urban infrastructure. And yet two individuals, buried within a few thousand years of each other in the same dune system, received treatments so distinct, so deliberate, and so labor-intensive that they imply an entire cosmology already in place. Cremation for one, ochre interment for the other. Two different protocols for two different people, each requiring its own knowledge and its own coordinated effort. What makes Lake Mungo particularly disturbing is the question it leaves hanging. If Aboriginal Australians were transporting ritual pigment across 200 kilometers of country 42,000 years ago, what were they doing 60,000 years ago when their ancestors first crossed the sea barrier from Southeast Asia into the continent? The earliest evidence of human occupation in Australia now extends to roughly 65,000 years. That leaves more than 20,000 years of ritual practice for which we have no archaeological record at all. The lakebed at Mungo preserved its dead because the sand dunes happened to remain stable. Across the rest of the continent, similar burials almost certainly took place, and the wind erased them. Mungo Man's bones lie reburied now in country, returned to his descendants in 2017. The red ochre that coated him 42,000 years ago is still embedded in the sand where he was found, staining the dune a faint, persistent pink under the Australian sun. Number 6. The Venus figurines and humanity's first goddesses. Between approximately 35,000 and 25,000 years ago, across a territory stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the frozen river valleys of Siberia, scattered bands of Ice Age humans began carving the same object. Not a tool, not a weapon. A small, rounded figure of a woman, palm-sized, exaggerated in form, deliberately shaped to emphasize breasts, hips, and belly. Archaeologists have cataloged over 200 of these figurines from sites separated by more than 6,000 kilometers of glacial wilderness. The carvings range from 4 to 25 centimeters in height. They were made from whatever durable material the local environment offered. Mammoth ivory along the steppe corridors, limestone in the karst regions of Central Europe, soft soapstone in the Pyrenees, fired clay in Moravia. The materials differ. The form does not. The implications begin with the geography itself. During the Upper Paleolithic, the populations that produced these figurines were not in contact with each other. The hunters carving mammoth ivory in what is now Russia had no knowledge of the artisans shaping limestone in the Dordogne. The distances were impossible. The intervening terrain was glacial desert, mountain barrier, and frozen river. Yet the same visual language emerged independently across the entire Eurasian landmass within the same window of geological time. The same emphasis on the female form. The same exaggeration of fertility-associated features. The same small, portable, intimate scale. Something was happening inside the Ice Age human mind that produced the same answer in completely separate places. In 1925, excavators at the site of Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, uncovered a figurine that pushed the implications further still. The Venus of Dolní Věstonice, carved approximately 29,000 years ago, was not made of stone or ivory. It was made of clay, mixed with powdered bone, deliberately shaped and fired in a kiln. It is the oldest known ceramic object in human history. The technology that would later produce pottery, bricks, porcelain, and every fired vessel in the human archaeological record was invented not to make containers, not to store food, not to carry water. It was invented to make a goddess. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. For over a century, the figurines were interpreted through a narrow lens. Fertility charms, Paleolithic erotica, hunting magic, talismans pressed into the hands of pregnant women. Each explanation fits some of the evidence and failed against the rest. The figurines appear in burial contexts. They appear in domestic contexts. They appear deliberately broken, deliberately buried, deliberately deposited in sites with no human remains at all. Many show wear patterns consistent with prolonged handling, suggesting they were carried for years, possibly across generations. Others appear to have been made and immediately interred. The pattern is consistent with something far more layered than fertility magic. It is consistent with veneration. What makes the Venus phenomenon particularly unsettling is what it implies about the human mind 30,000 years before the First Temple. These were not isolated artistic experiments. They represent the earliest known evidence of a shared symbolic system spanning a continent. A concept of the sacred feminine, or at minimum a shared cognitive template recognizing the female form as worthy of representation, ritual, and preservation, emerged simultaneously among populations that had been genetically and culturally separated for tens of thousands of years. Either the idea traveled along migration routes we cannot reconstruct, or it emerged independently because something in the human mind, at that moment in evolutionary history, was ready to produce it. The figurines outlasted the cultures that made them by a margin that defies comprehension. The hunters who carved the Venus of Willendorf were dead before the last ice sheets retreated. The artisans who fired the Venus of Dolny Vestanich lived in a world without agriculture, without metal, without writing, without cities. The civilizations that would later worship Inanna, Isis, Demeter, Cybele, and Kali emerged tens of thousands of years after these small figures were buried in the frozen earth. And yet the form recurs, the same exaggerated curves, the same rounded bellies, the same emphasis on the generative power of the female body. The figurines suggest that humanity's first deity may not have been a sky god, a sun god, or a thunder god. She may have been a woman, carved in ivory, small enough to hold in one hand, and she watched over Ice Age Europe from the Pyrenees to the Urals for 10,000 years before anything resembling history began. Number 5. The Lascaux Cave Initiations. In September 1940, 4 teenagers and a dog stumbled into a hole in the wooded hills of the Dordogne region in southwestern France and found themselves standing inside what may be the most elaborate ceremonial space ever constructed by Ice Age humans. The cave system at Lascaux had been sealed for approximately 17,000 years. When the boys lowered their lamps into the first chamber, the light fell on walls covered in red and black bulls 4 meters long, charging across limestone in pigments that had not faded since the last glacial maximum. The discovery was treated as an art find. Decades of subsequent research suggest it was something else entirely. The paintings at Lascaux were not made for viewing in any sense we would recognize. The galleries that contain the most concentrated imagery sit hundreds of meters from the original entrance, accessible only through passages that narrow to crawl spaces requiring sustained effort to traverse. Some chambers can only be reached by moving on hands and knees for hours through pitch darkness, navigating drops and constrictions that would have been lethal without intimate prior knowledge of the route. The bulls, the stags, the horses, the strange composite creatures painted in the chamber, known as the apse, were not displayed. They were hidden, accessible only to those willing to descend. The footprints preserved in the cave's clay floors tell us who was making that descent. Many of them belong to adolescents, children old enough to fit through the narrowest passages, young enough that their feet had not yet reached adult size, walking in single file into chambers that no functional purpose required them to enter. Whatever was happening at Lascaux involved bringing the young into the deepest sections of the earth and showing them something that could not be shown anywhere else. Then the acoustic research began. In a series of studies starting in the late 1980s and refined through subsequent decades, researchers mapped the sonic properties of the cave's chambers against the distribution of the paintings. The correlation was unmistakable. The densest concentrations of imagery cluster precisely in the chambers, with the strongest resonance, the longest reverberation times, the most pronounced echoes. Passages with poor acoustics are nearly bare. Chambers where a single human voice can sustain itself in standing waves for seconds after the speaker has stopped are covered floor to ceiling in animals. The painters were not choosing their canvases based on stone quality or accessibility. They were choosing them based on sound. This reframes everything. Lascaux was not a gallery. It was an instrument. Consider what the experience would have been. An adolescent led for hours through total darkness by elders carrying tallow lamps. The only light a flickering yellow glow that animated the painted animals into something approaching motion. The temperature dropping. The air thickening with the smell of burning fat and damp limestone. The sound of dripping water amplified by the chamber's geometry into something that seemed to come from inside the listener's skull. And then, in the deepest galleries, voices. Chanting, perhaps. Percussion against the cave walls. Tones sustained until they bloomed into standing waves and the chamber itself seemed to sing back. The bulls would have appeared to breathe in the torchlight. The herds painted across curved walls would have seemed to move as the lamps moved. The acoustic resonance would have made the painted animals seem to vocalize. For a child who had never been more than a few meters from open sky, the experience would have been indistinguishable from an encounter with the animals themselves, brought into being by sound and fire deep beneath the world. What makes Lascaux particularly disturbing is what it tells us about cognitive sophistication 17,000 years ago. The builders understood acoustics well enough to map resonance across hundreds of meters of complex three-dimensional space. They understood psychology well enough to engineer disorientation, sensory overload, and altered states through controlled environmental stimulus. They understood symbolism well enough to know that an image of a bull encountered in the deep dark accompanied by sound would mark a young mind permanently in a way that no instruction in daylight ever could. They were not stumbling toward ritual. They were practicing applied neuroscience with materials they had refined over thousands of years. And Lascaux is not alone. Chauvet, Altamira, Neo, Pechmerle, dozens of decorated caves across France and Spain show the same pattern. Paintings clustered in resonant chambers, access routes engineered for difficulty, evidence of adolescent passage into the deepest sections. The phenomenon was continental in scale and lasted for tens of thousands of years. The teenagers who walked into Lascaux in 1940 had no idea they were entering a temple. The teenagers who walked in 17,000 years earlier knew exactly where they were, what they were shown in those chambers, what was sung into the stone above their heads, what they understood about the world when they finally crawled back into daylight. None of it survives in any form we can read. The walls remember. We do not. Number 4. The antler headdresses of Star Carr. In 1949, an amateur archaeologist named John Moore noticed something dark protruding from the peat of a drained Yorkshire marsh near Scarborough. What his excavations would reveal over the following decade, and what subsequent generations of researchers would continue extracting from the waterlogged ground into the 2000s, was one of the most extraordinary ritual assemblages ever recovered from the Mesolithic. Star Carr, a lakeside settlement occupied by hunter-gatherers approximately 11,000 years ago, when Britain was still tethered to continental Europe by the drowned lowlands of Doggerland, and the ice sheets had only recently begun their retreat northward. From the black peat, the excavators pulled 21 red deer skulls, not eaten, not discarded, modified. The frontal bones had been thinned and shaped. The antlers, in some cases reduced in weight but retained at full span, remained attached. Small holes had been drilled deliberately through the bone at the rear of each skull, threaded for cords that would have secured the structure to a human head. These were not trophies mounted on walls that did not yet exist. They were not byproducts of butchery. They were wearable objects. A craftsman, 11 millennia ago, had taken the skull of a stag and engineered it into a mask. 21 of them, from a single site. The implications begin to accumulate the moment the function is grasped. A person wearing one of these headdresses would have transformed silhouette and silhouette alone. A human body, topped by the crown of a stag. Antlers branching 3 feet into the air, the dead animal's face fused to the living one beneath it. In firelight, against the reed beds of a glacial lake, the effect would have been incomprehensible to anyone who had not been taught what they were witnessing. The wearer would not have looked like a hunter. The wearer would have looked like something between. What makes the Star Carr assemblage particularly disturbing is not the masks themselves. It is where some of them ended up. Several of the headdresses, along with worked antler points, flint tools, and wooden platforms constructed at the water's edge, were deliberately deposited into the lake. Not lost, not abandoned, placed. Mesolithic Britons walked to the shoreline of a body of water their ancestors had occupied for generations and surrendered objects of enormous labor investment to its depths. The water received them. The water kept them. 11,000 years later, peat preserved what running rivers would have erased. The standard interpretations divide between two possibilities. The first is hunting magic, the wearer becoming the prey to approach it, or to summon it, or to negotiate with whatever spirit was understood to govern the herds. The second is shamanic ritual, the wearer becoming the prey to cross into a register of experience inaccessible to the ordinary body. Neither possibility is comfortable. Both require Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in post-glacial Britain to have possessed a developed framework of spirit transformation, animal mediation, and ritual specialists trained to enact it. And here the geography becomes the most unsettling element of all. Antler headdresses, drum frames mounted with deer crowns, and shamanic costumes incorporating reindeer or elk skulls appear across the Siberian taiga, among Evenki and Sami and Tungusic peoples, documented by ethnographers across the 19th and 20th centuries. The Star Carr masks predate those ethnographies by 11,000 years. They originate thousands of kilometers to the west, in a population that had no contact with Eastern Eurasia in any sense recognizable to history. Yet the practice is, in form and apparent function, the same. Either the convergence is coincidence, or animal spirit shamanism is older and more deeply rooted in the human nervous system than any institutional religion that followed. The headdresses sit in cases at the Yorkshire Museum and the British Museum now, hollow-eyed, antlers intact, drilled cord holes still visible in the bone. They were made to be worn. Whatever was meant to happen when a person put one on, that knowledge went into the lake with the others. Number 3. The Gough's Cave Skull Cups. In 2011, a team of researchers at the Natural History Museum in London, led by paleoanthropologist Sylvia Bello, published findings on a collection of human skulls recovered from Gough's Cave in Cheddar Gorge, England. The skulls were approximately 14,700 years old. They had been meticulously cleaned, carefully shaped, and converted into drinking cups. The cave sits in a limestone gorge in Somerset, a landscape carved by ancient meltwater into walls that rise nearly 140 meters above the valley floor. Gough's Cave itself extends deep into the rock, a network of chambers and passages that have yielded human remains since the late 19th century. For decades, the bones recovered from its sediment were treated as evidence of straightforward prehistoric cannibalism. Survival behavior, perhaps, during the harsh climatic instability of the late Pleistocene. The interpretation was tidy. It was also wrong. The bones told a different story under modern analysis. Cut marks ran along the jawbones in patterns consistent with deliberate defleshing. Long bones had been deliberately broken to extract marrow. Tooth impressions on certain fragments indicated human chewing. None of this was unusual on its own. The archaeological record contains other examples of cannibalism driven by famine or warfare. What set Gough's Cave apart was what happened to the skulls afterward. The cranial vaults had been processed with extraordinary care. Facial bones were removed cleanly. The edges of the skulls were chipped and smoothed into regular rims. Surface scrape marks indicated the bone had been polished. The end result was a series of cups, vessels shaped from human heads with a level of craftsmanship that required time, skill, and intent. These were not the byproducts of desperate butchery. They were finished objects. They had been made. The numbers underscore the deliberation. At least 3 individuals, including an adult, an adolescent, and a young child, were processed into skull cups in this single cave. The cut mark patterns across multiple specimens are nearly identical, suggesting a standardized technique passed between practitioners. The processing was systematic. The output was uniform. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and had done it before. But here's where the conventional explanation falls apart. Survival cannibalism does not produce polished bowls. Starving populations do not invest hours of careful labor sculpting the remains of the dead into ceremonial vessels. The energy expended in shaping these skulls vastly exceeded any nutritional return. The cups themselves had no practical advantage over wood, bone, or hide containers that could be produced in a fraction of the time. There was no functional reason to make a drinking vessel out of a human head. There was only a symbolic one. The implications reorganize what we thought we knew about the people who lived in late Ice Age Britain. These were Magdalenian hunter-gatherers, a culture spread across Europe at the edge of the retreating glaciers. They produced sophisticated toolkits, hunted reindeer and horse across open tundra, and left behind some of the earliest art in the European archaeological record. They were not desperate. They were not primitive. And in Gough's cave, they were performing a funerary rite that combined consumption of the dead with the transformation of those dead into objects of continued use. The interpretation favored by Bellow's team is that this was ancestral cannibalism, a ritual through which the living honored the dead by consuming them and then preserved a part of them as a vessel. The skull cup may have held liquid in subsequent ceremonies. It may have been passed between generations. It may have been the means by which an ancestor remained present at every gathering long after the body had been eaten. The act was not desecration. It was integration. What makes Gough's cave particularly disturbing is how completely it inverts the modern instinct. The processing of these bodies looks, to a contemporary eye, like the worst thing humans can do to each other. To the people who did it, it may have been the highest honor they could offer the dead. Reverence and consumption were not opposites. They were the same act. The polished skull bowls sit today in museum collections, cream-colored and smooth, their interiors holding nothing. Number 2, the Göbekli Tepe sky burials, the temple that came before farming. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd tending his flock on a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey noticed something strange protruding from the soil. A smooth curve of carved limestone, deliberately shaped, projecting from a hillside that had been dismissed as a medieval cemetery for half a century. The shepherd reported the find. The report reached Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist working with the Istanbul branch of the German Archaeological Institute. Schmidt visited the site and recognized within hours what previous surveys had missed for decades. The hilltop wasn't a cemetery. It was a temple, and the temple was older than anything its discovery should have been possible to find. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill in Turkish, and what Schmidt's excavations revealed over the following 2 decades reordered the foundations of human prehistory. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some reaching 18 feet in height and weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in concentric circular enclosures across a 22-acre site. The pillars are carved with reliefs of staggering sophistication. Vultures with outspread wings, scorpions frozen mid-strike, foxes, snakes, wild boars, and aurochs rendered in low relief with an artistic confidence that shouldn't have existed in the people who made them. Headless human figures appear on certain pillars, their bodies depicted without skulls, as though the absence itself carried meaning. The dating is what broke the field. Radiocarbon analysis of organic material from the construction layers places Göbekli Tepe's earliest enclosures at approximately 11,500 years old. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates the invention of pottery. It predates the wheel. It predates writing by nearly 6 millennia. Most catastrophically, for the standard timeline of human development, it predates agriculture itself. This is the detail that refuses to settle. Every textbook model of how civilization emerged depends on a specific sequence. First farming, then surplus food, then permanent settlements, then social hierarchy, then organized religion, then monumental architecture. Each stage was understood to require the one before it. You cannot quarry 20-ton limestone blocks with flint tools and drag them up a hill without organized labor. You cannot organize that labor without surplus food. You cannot generate surplus food without farming. The sequence was considered settled. Göbekli Tepe inverts it. The people who built this complex were hunter-gatherers. They had not yet domesticated wheat. They had not yet built cities. They had no kings, no scribes, no economic infrastructure of any kind that the Standard Model recognizes as necessary preconditions for monumental construction. And yet, they quarried, transported, and carved limestone pillars heavier than 3 African elephants, arranged them in geometrically precise enclosures, and decorated them with imagery so consistent across the site that it must represent a shared symbolic system. A religion, in other words, a cosmology rendered in stone before the first field of grain was ever sown. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing. The iconography itself reveals what the temple was for. The dominant motif across the carved pillars is the vulture, wings spread, beaks angled downward, depicted in active engagement with human forms that lack heads. Archaeological analysis of bone fragments recovered from the site has identified cut marks and weathering patterns consistent with excarnation, the deliberate exposure of bodies to scavenging birds before the cleaned bones were collected and interred. Sky burial. The same ritual practice still performed in parts of Tibet and Mongolia, where the dead are offered to vultures as a final transformation of the body into something that takes flight. At Göbekli Tepe, the practice appears to be encoded into the architecture itself. The vultures on the pillars aren't decorative. They are participants. The temple is a machine for processing the dead. And then, around 8000 BCE, the builders did something that no one has been able to explain. They buried it. Not abandoned. Not left to weather and collapse. Buried. They deliberately filled in the enclosures with rubble, soil, and animal bones, sealing the entire complex beneath an artificial hill. The labor required to bury Göbekli Tepe rivaled the labor required to build it. Whatever the temple was, whatever the vultures had done there, whatever transformations had been performed in those circular chambers, the people who knew its meaning decided it needed to be hidden. From whom remains unknown. For what reason remains unknown. The site sat beneath its earthen shroud for 10,000 years until a shepherd noticed a stone that shouldn't have been there. What Göbekli Tepe forces us to accept is a sequence the textbooks were never built to contain. Religion did not emerge from civilization. Civilization may have emerged from religion. The first thing organized human labor built was not a granary, not a wall, not a palace. It was a temple to receive the dead and offer them to the sky. Everything else, the farming, the cities, the empires, came afterward. The gods were here first. Number 1. Neolithic trepanation. In a quiet drawer of the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, there is a skull with a hole in it. The hole is roughly circular, about the diameter of a modern coin, cut cleanly through the parietal bone above the right ear. The edges of the opening are smooth, rounded, and grown over with new bone. The person whose skull this was did not die from the wound. They lived. They lived for years afterward, walking through Neolithic Europe with a window in their head. The earliest examples date back more than 7,000 years. They have been recovered from burial sites across France, Germany, Denmark, the Czech Republic, Russia, Britain, and the Iberian Peninsula. The geographic spread is the first staggering fact. Communities separated by thousands of kilometers, with no shared writing, no known trade in medical knowledge, were independently drilling holes into the heads of living human beings. The practice was not a regional anomaly. It was a continental technology. The tools were flint and obsidian. Sharpened stone blades, scrapers, and drills capable of grinding through the human skull layer by layer. Archaeologists have identified at least 4 distinct surgical techniques in the Neolithic record. Scraping, in which the bone was abraded away in slow concentric passes. Grooving, in which a circular channel was cut until a plug of bone could be lifted out. Drilling, in which a ring of small holes was connected. Sawing, in which straight cuts intersected to free a rectangular section. Each technique required a surgeon who knew exactly when to stop. A blade pressed a millimeter too far would pierce the dura mater and kill the patient instantly. There was no anesthesia. There was no antiseptic. There was no understanding of bacteria, of blood pressure, of the brain itself as a discrete organ. The patient was awake. The patient was held down. The patient felt the grinding vibration of stone against bone transmitted through their own skull for what may have been hours. And the patients survived. Modern analyses of trepanned skulls show healing rates that defy expectation. Studies of Neolithic samples from France have found that the majority of trepanation patients lived long enough for substantial bone regrowth around the wound. Some skulls show 2 openings. Some show 3. Some show 4 in different stages of healing, indicating that the same individual underwent multiple surgeries across years or decades and survived each one. The procedure was repeatable. It was reliable enough that people came back for more. This is the oldest documented surgical practice in human history. It predates the first cities. It predates the invention of the wheel. It predates writing by thousands of years. And it was being performed at a level of consistent technical success that took post-medieval European surgeons until the 19th century to match. When trepanation was reintroduced into modern hospitals in the 1800s, the mortality rate exceeded 70%. The Neolithic mortality rate, based on healed skull counts, appears to have been dramatically lower. But here's where the standard explanation collapses. The question is not how they did it. The question is, why? A portion of the skulls show clear evidence of head trauma, depressed fractures from blows, projectile injuries from hunting or warfare. For these patients, trepanation may have been a genuine medical intervention, a release of pressure on a swelling brain. The procedure works. It still works. Modern neurosurgeons perform a version of it today under the term craniotomy, but the trauma cases are a minority. Most trepanned skulls show no underlying injury at all. The patients were not sick. They were not wounded. Something else was being treated. The leading interpretations point toward the invisible. Headaches that would not stop. Seizures that arrived without warning. Voices in the skull. Visions. Possession. Whatever the Neolithic mind understood as a spirit pressing against the bone from the inside, demanding release. The hole was the door. The surgery was the exorcism. The patient walked away with proof, in healed bone, that the door had been opened and the thing inside had been let out. What makes this practice the final entry on this list is what it forces us to acknowledge. 7,000 years ago, in scattered villages across an unwritten continent, human beings were lying down in front of other human beings and consenting to have their skulls opened with stone tools while fully conscious. They believed in the procedure. They believed in the surgeon. They believed in whatever cosmology made the suffering of that hour preferable to the suffering of whatever lived inside their heads. And the surgeon believed in it enough to commit, hour after hour, to a technique precise enough to keep the patient alive. The coin-sized cavities are still there, held in museum drawers across Europe, smooth-edged, healed. The bone remembers exactly what happened, and the bone is the only thing left that does. 10 rituals. 10 windows into minds that should have been simpler than ours and weren't. The pattern is consistent. From a limestone cave in Iraqi Kurdistan, where flowers were laid against pale bone, to a pit in northern Spain, where a pink quartzite hand axe was placed among the dead, to a salt pan lake bed in Australia, stained with ochre, carried 200 kilometers across a continent. From the antler headdresses of Yorkshire to the goddess figurines of Siberia. From the vulture pillars of Göbekli Tepe to the skull cups of Cheddar Gorge. The geography spans every habitable landmass our species reached. The chronology spans nearly 500,000 years. And the themes do not change. Death, transformation, fertility, the reverence of the animals that fed and frightened them, the careful tending of the body after the spirit had gone, the marking of a person, a place, a passage, with something that was not strictly necessary for survival. Across continents that had no contact with each other, across species that diverged hundreds of thousands of years before language as we understand it existed. The same impulses surface in the archaeological record. Bury the dead with intention. Mark the body with pigment. Honor the predator. Carve the mother. Cross the threshold with ceremony. These rituals predate agriculture. They predate writing. They predate cities, kingdoms, coinage, organized priesthoods, the wheel, the domestication of every animal we now consider domestic. The Atapuerca pit pushes intentional treatment of the dead to roughly 430,000 years ago, a span of time so vast that anatomically modern humans had not yet evolved when those bodies were lowered into the dark. Whatever performed that act was not us. It was something that came before us. And it already understood, on some level we cannot reconstruct, that the dead required more than abandonment. What makes this pattern particularly unsettling is what it implies about the depth of the human interior. Ritual is not a byproduct of civilization. Civilization is a byproduct of ritual. The capacity to imagine an unseen world, to act symbolically toward an absent presence, to invest a stone or a flower or a skull with meaning beyond its physical form. This capacity is older than every institution we have ever built on top of it. The pyramids, the cathedrals, the temples, the funerals we hold this week in cities we believe are modern, all of it descends from impulses that were already ancient when the last ice age was still grinding across Europe. The people who performed these rites are gone. We do not know their names. We do not know what they called. They're dead. What words they spoke over the bodies. What they believed the flowers were doing. What they thought the antlers conferred on the wearer. What the vulture meant when it descended on the exposed body at Göbekli Tepe. The languages they used to describe their own ceremonies disappeared without a single phoneme preserved. Their cosmologies, their theologies, their stories about why any of this mattered, all of it is gone. But the evidence persists. The pollen still clings to the soil of Shanidar Cave. The ochre still stains the bones at Lake Mungo. The skull cups still sit in the museum cases of Gough's cave, polished and cream-colored. Scrape marks still visible under raking light. The hand axe at the bottom of the Cima de los Huesos still glitters its faint rose color in the beam of an archaeologist's headlamp. The bare skulls in the alpine dark. The headdresses in the Yorkshire peat. The figurines in the drawers of 100 institutions, worn smooth by hands that have been dust for 30,000 years. They were dreamers. They were mourners. They were healers who drilled into the skulls of the conscious and somehow brought them back. They were mystics who crawled for hours through stone passages to paint bulls in chambers that echoed like cathedrals. They were the first to lay a flower on a body and mean something by it. They were the first to look at a predator and bow. They were the first to imagine a mother who was also a goddess. They were the first to mark the threshold between this world and whatever they believed lay on the other side of it. We inherited everything from them. The instinct to grieve, the instinct to bless, the instinct to gather around a fire and tell a story about why the dead are not entirely gone. Every ceremony performed anywhere on Earth this week is a continuation of a thread that runs unbroken back into a darkness older than our species itself. The history books begin a few thousand years ago. The history of the human interior begins far, far deeper than that. And most of it will never be recovered. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.